Hi, welcome to the Canadian City and Southern Model Railroad in HO and HOn3. This is Canadian City and Southern number 8, and it's a Blackstone model, and it's all apart. Well, why is it all apart? A couple years ago, I had the tender apart and a little bit of the superstructure apart in order to replace the decoder. Blackstone has an excellent video on how to do that, and I called them on the phone and verified that it really was the decoder that was fouled up. So I fixed it all up, and at that time I slightly backdated it. Put in a diamond stack and redid the paint a little bit, removed one of the compressors, and it ran fine for a long time after that. And it ran a lot because it's one of my best running engines. It's a Blackstone. Then a couple months back, it simply died. I thought it was perhaps the decoder again. But after thorough testing and then finally resetting to factory defaults, which turned it back to number 3, it still wouldn't run. So I took it apart and tested the motor straight on DC, and sure enough, it's the motor that's out. So I ordered up 3 more, and turns out this is an N20 size motor. And I got 3 double shafts cheap, but I had to wait a few weeks to get them. I've decided to go ahead and make some minor modifications in order to add a firelight. Now I've had to grind out this hole a little larger, and I had to replace the drawbar pin with a wooden pin, because when I enlarged the hole, I shorted the 2 sides together, and when I tested with the meter, I realized that's not going to work. So I replaced the drawbar pin with a hard wooden dowel, which I then drilled and tapped and superglued and tapped again to fit the original screw. And there's a little more room here. And I did the same thing on this part to let a little more light up in and down, and to leave more room for the wires to go through, since it will now need 8 wires instead of 6 to go between the tender and the rest of the locomotive. So now it's time to start putting it back together. The first thing that I have done is to put the drivers back into the frame. Beep. No beep. The frame is isolated on both sides, as it should be. The next step is going to be to put the motor mount back onto the top part of the frame, which I have done, and then to put the top part of the frame onto the bottom part of the frame. And I need to make sure that I get this little spacer in here, because that's going to prevent shorts. It's also going to hold the motor at exact right height. The motor mount has been screwed to the top half of the frame. The top half of the frame has been screwed to the bottom half of the frame. And it's been checked to make sure that the 2 sides of the frame are still electrically isolated. And it rolls nice and smooth. Or it would if I had a nice clean workbench that was never cut or sanded or scraped or painted on. The next step was to remove the flywheel and the gear and get it on the new motor. Now I had to destroy the old motor to do that. There's a couple ways to do that. One is to use a puller from Northwest Shortline. And the idea is and this is the new motor, by the way, you put this little piece of steel like that and hold it like that and advance the pusher up to the gear and pull it off. But this motor has a 1mm shaft, and none of these are that small. Now they make one with a little hole in the end, and I took a piece of 1mm shaft material and put it in there and tried that, and it still didn't work very well. I was able to get the flywheel off, but getting the gear off was another matter. So what I did, and I know about this from past experience, I used my resistance soldering tool. Now the way you do that, and I'm not going to turn it on because this is the new motor and the gear is on here already, but you put it between the motor and the gear and you heat up the gear and simply pull it off. You're not going to be able to pull it off with needle nose pliers or any other way like that, but once it's hot enough it'll pop right off because the brass expands faster than the steel shaft. So that's how I got the gear off. Then I simply tap the flywheel and the gear gently back on, and I used, since the shaft is longer on the flywheel end, I used this little tool, which is an attachment to the puller, Northwest Shortline puller, which has a hole in the middle, and I gently tapped on the flywheel, then I gently tapped on the gear. You need to do this very gently or you'll mess the gear up. Then I cut off the excess of the shaft on the flywheel end. Most of the wiring is now in place. I decided to use a whole new harness because the original was pretty tangled up. Plus, on the original, it was soldered to the original wires from the model, which are no longer useful. The only thing that isn't hooked up back in the tender is the tail light. All of the resistors are going to be back here in the tender. The speakers are wired up. The harness from the original decoder for the speakers and what will be the firebox light was used from the original. The brown wire has been removed totally because that went to the little circuit that ran the sync to the drivers, which is no longer necessary on the newer decoders. I'll feed all the wires up through the hole in the frame and hook all that up. That will be the next step. Then I can attach the drawbar. On the motor, I've put a little piece of medical tape on one side because the original, which is now further destroyed, had a little piece of tape here as well. I suspect that was a spacer so that the gears don't mesh too tight, although they mesh okay without it anyway. But just in case, I'll do like it had on the original. The engine frame and the tender have been screwed together. All the wiring is now done inside the tender. All the necessary resistors are hooked up. Everything's all securely covered with heat shrink, and the LED for the tail light is hooked up. And it's small enough that it can go through the hole at the back of the tender and up into the tender backup light without having to attach it to the tender shell prior to soldering, which is a neater way of doing it. Right here, there's two long screws. One's already screwed in place. This was used to attach the little board that was in here. This is the board that was right in here. It had a triple purpose. One was to detect the rotation of the little cam that synchronized the chuff on the original model, which wasn't necessary after the decoder was upgraded. The other was to attach the power from the two sides of the frame back to the decoder and to the tender trucks. The third was to provide the resistors for the front headlight. But it is no longer needed because two of the three functions aren't necessary. So the long screw on the end of the black and red wires, I soldered a tiny little washer, brass washer. Then I put a tiny little bit of heat shrink tubing over the screw. The reason for that is to make sure when the screw goes through into the bottom of the frame that it doesn't make any kind of an electrical contact with the rest of the frame, causing a potential short. So that will replace one of the three functions that is still needed for the model. Here I've got a tiny little super bright LED, and it's been dipped in yellow gallery glass. The whole thing's been covered and it's been allowed to dry. This will be the LED for the fire. Now that it's dry, I'll put some tiny little dots of red glass, not covering the whole thing, but just a few little dots. The result will be, when it's flickering away, that there will be orange, yellow, and red little bits of light coming out the bottom of the model to represent the fire. Now that most of the wires have been run through the slightly expanded holes here, I'll be able to feed that up from the bottom and do the final hookups, and finally hook in the motor and test everything. Now comes the moment of truth. Continuity was all checked at the bench with the meter, but the orange and gray wires on the motor do need to be reversed so that the lights come on in the proper order. Then the final step, now that the gallery glass is dry, is to fit the tiny little LED for the firebox fire in place. Reverse the orange and gray, and then I can start to reassemble it. Now there's several little things that'll still need to be done on the superstructure. A couple of the little bits have been broken off of that. Number 8 is all back together now. The running board that was knocked off while I was working on it, that front headline that was knocked off while I was working on it, been put back in place, and all the parts are back on the model. Tiny little touch-ups have been done to the paint, and it's ready to test. It's been on the programmer. Since the decoder was reset, everything had to be reprogrammed to get its address and all of its various functions back to normal, and also to add the function of the flickering firebox light. So now it's time to shut down the programmer and turn off my computer and test it out. Turn off the programming track, which is also my log dump of the future. And that's my programming track because it's close to the edge of the layout. And it's dual gauge. Now I'm going to check things out by picking up a caboose and doing a track inspection. Well, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share, and we'll see you next time.